and touching as well. And now, Dora, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Good.
My name is Dora Patarica, and I'm a researcher at Åbo Academy University, which is in Finland, and also at the Szeged Jewish community. And this specific presentation of mine, I'm representing the institution of the Szeged Jewish community, so my research project's running there. I'm going to talk about children's testimonies related to the history of deportations from Szeged. For those of you, I'm not sure how many of you have been in Szeged, but it's in southern Hungary, close to the border of Serbia and Romania, on both banks of the river Tisa. It's an agricultural city, mostly famous for food production, such as, for example, paprika and salami. In 2018 and 19, we have, for the purpose of preservation and publish accessibility, sorry, one moment. Yes, so here I am. For the purpose of preservation and accessibility, we have cataloged, indexed, and digitized almost all of the documents of the Szeged Jewish community, altogether 25 linear meters. And there were approximately 5 linear meters of documents related to the Holocaust in Szeged. The community holds several different kinds of documents, such as vital registers, school records, burial records, board minutes, all kinds of requests, correspondence, even architectural plans. And these form the basis of all the running projects, research projects. On the picture, you can see my colleague Zsolt Urbancsok, who is a chief archivist at the Csongrád County Archive. The Jewry of Szeged is a very special case within Hungary, because Szeged was the focal point of Neolog Judaism, which is a progressive branch of Judaism, but they can be called the most conservative reformists. And on the top of this movement, the Löw rabbis were Lipót Löw and his son Immanuel Löw, who both officiated for a long time in Szeged. And after the Treaty of Trianon, when the University of Kolozsvár was moved to Szeged, it became a university and also a very important center of science and also culture. And the Jews of Szeged contributed to this in a significant way, so to all of these fields. An excellent example of this is that of the Pick family. On the picture, you can see a salami. Mark Pick was already born in Szeged in the middle of the 19th century. And he realized that the circumstances in Szeged create an excellent opportunity to produce salami, which of course is made of pork. But he realized this financial opportunity. He created the perfect salami. He became very soon successful, but at least according to oral history and the story of by his granddaughter Vera Pick, he never tasted it because he remained Jewish and he had a strong Jewish identity, but he was able to create to make a financial success. Very shortly, I'm going to talk about the Hungarian Holocaust. After the German occupation of Hungary, in only 3 months, altogether 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported. and most of them were deported to Auschwitz with a very active cooperation of Hungarian authorities. The majority of them were murdered within 24 hours of arrival, and there is hardly any records on them in Auschwitz. So all the records that we have on them we must find them in Hungary. And out of these 440,000 Hungarian Jews, 15,000 Hungarian Jews from Szeged, Debrecen, and Szolnok were sent to Strasshof near Vienna, most probably as a deal between Rezső Kastner and Eichmann. And the survivor rates between these two groups, no need to say it was significantly different, since the concentration camp in near Strasshof was a labor camp, but not a death camp. The Jews of Szeged were sent to the ghetto in May 1944. Here you can see what it looked like back then with a wooden fence. This was the border of the ghetto, and in the background you can see the headquarters of the Szeged Jewish community. And this is on the right-hand side, a recent picture. It's still used as the headquarters of the Szeged Jewish community. We do have the ghettoization list from the Szeged Jewish Archive, which gives us names, the title, the family status, the place and the year of birth, the occupation, addresses. There are pencil-written marks, which might be signs of whether the person survived or not. And altogether, there are 3,881 entries. Here you can see magnified my grandmother's grandmother, Vilmosné Fuchs, who was born in Érsekújvár, which is now in Slovakia, and one of her daughters, Borbála Fuchs. Three trains deported from Szeged with a total number of 8,500 Jews. It was not only the Jewry of Szeged, but also from the surrounding villages and towns. The first one was sent to Auschwitz, and almost everyone was killed. The second one was decoupled, and the first part went to Auschwitz, and the second part went to Strasshof. And the third one was deliberately sent to Strasshof. So these were the three trains. I have now two projects running in Szeged, in the Szeged Jewish community, and I'm the project initiator and also the project director of both of these. We try to reconstruct the list of transports. These three lists, the records haven't survived, and we would like to find out what were the criteria for the selection and who had a chance of, what kind of chances did the people have for survival. For this, we combine all available sources, such as scientific and non-scientific literature, all available testimonies, memoirs, videos of the survivors, and of course the documents in the archives. And we also have to adapt new research techniques from digital humanities to advance the research. We are managing a quite big data set. We merge all kinds of data, and we have to solve contradictions. And we recently also got a grant from IRA, and with this grant we would like to make a digital memorial wall for the memory of all of those who were deported from Szeged. And as I said, we would like to reconstruct the names of these 8,500 individuals deported from Szeged and their stories. Szeged was liberated by the Red Army in October 1944. And it also meant that Szeged was liberated before the Arrow Cross Party could take over in Szeged. We have two main sets of records of the survivals. Here you can see the report cards of the survivals from Szeged, altogether 1,600 such report cards, mentioning also relatives. This one is the report card of my grandmother's grandmother, again, who survived. She arrived from Theresienstadt on July 4th, together with her daughter. She first had to stay in the Borsch Hotel for disinfection. And we also have a list of survivors at the Árosen archive. And here I'd like to show you a couple of contradictions, and also this explains why we need IT technology. So here you can see that in one of the papers, she's called Fish, that's the family name, while her correct name is Fuchs. Also, the year of birth is not the same, nor is the occupation. So that's why we use massively all kinds of modern IT. I have to point out that the situation in Szeged is exceptional, because there was an estimated 50 to 60% of survivors. This is exceptional in Hungary. Most of the Jews from the Hungarian countryside were killed immediately in Auschwitz. Now what we try to do is reconstructing the list of transportations with the help of testimonies, including testimonies of those who were children at the time, and also the ghettoization list and the two lists of survivors, the one at the Szeged Jewish community and the other one at Árosen archive. I was pondering among the oral testimonies at USHMM when I found the testimony of our family doctor, and it turned out that he was on the third transport together with a famous physician who was deliberately on the third transport. So this piece of information that a simple, like a regular child, nothing, no special family background, could be on the third transport, helps us reconstruct those groups who were selected for the third transport. We have testimonies saying that for the third transport, the leaders of the Szeged Jewish community had to put together a list of 2,400 names. Those who were considered prominent people, those who were family members of men in forced labor, and finally also families with many children. So obviously, István Langermann, who luckily survived and also became a physician, was most probably sent on the third transport because he was considered a member of someone in forced labor. On this picture, you can see Vera Pick, the granddaughter of the establisher of the salami factory, who wrote a book on her memories, The Least Expected Heroes of the Holocaust. And here you can see her with her husband, who is also a survivor. He was in forced labor. Vera survived the war and described her memories in this book. Her father was killed in Bergen-Belsen. And it's only in Vera's book that I came across the story of selection in Strasshof. After a few days, we arrived at Strasshof in Austria and were told to get out of the train. We found ourselves in a huge open field where we sat on the grass and also slept there. That was the first time I saw my father cry. We were standing there and his tears started to flow. A large number of people who had small children were taken straight to Auschwitz, where Dr. Mengele was playing God, deciding who should live and who should die. Vera was only 11 years at this stage, but she still clearly remembers this process of selection, even in Strasshof. And this this testimony by a child is supporting the fact that Armin Kecskeméti, the rabbi of Mako, who decided not to part from his followers, from his members of the community, he was too sent to Strasshof, but in Strasshof, it was decided that he's too old, so he was sent from Strasshof to Auschwitz. And the only testimony that we have on this is that of Vera Pick, who was 11 years at that time, as I said. Another child's testimony, that of Veronika Szőlős, who was born in 1937, meaning that she was 7 at the time of the deportation. She was born in Szeged in one of the prominent families because her grandmother was the leader of the Jewish kindergarten of Szeged. Very exceptionally, she was deported together with her parents and also the maternal grandparents. And in here, she describes how her family could influence the choice or the selection of people who were deemed to be taken with the third transport. She also remembers how they went by train for days together with 5 adults, her parents and the grandparents. And she also has like very strong memories of this whole process. This quote, again by the memories based on the memories of a 7-year-old child. It was then that I first saw women who had been stripped because they were wearing a tent a week. This quote refers to the fact that there must have been also religious Jews in the same transport, meaning that members of the Mako Orthodox Jewish community must have been on the same transport. And also, I think I don't have time to read this out, but very interestingly, she also describes a memory where she realized that her father is not able to take care of them, a very strong emotional memory. And finally, I would like to give you an example how in certain occasions there is no other choice but to talk with these survivors who, even though they were children at the time. I'm in correspondence with Mrs. János Horváth, who is the granddaughter of Immanuel Löw, the chief rabbi. She was born in 1931 in Szeged, which means that at the time of the deportation, she was 13 years old. I came across a testimony by her father in which he stated that beside those names of the 2,400 people who were selected for the third transport, there was an additional list with 66 names, and he wrote down the names of the heads of the families and the number of those that have to be taken from the same family. And this would total 66. It doesn't, I think it's 63 altogether. But all it does is saying the head of the family and the number. So what I'm trying to do now is to reconstruct who were those 66 people who were under exception and who were then sent to Budapest and not to Strasshof. And what I have is an email correspondence with her in which she says that her father used to recall the story when the German commander appeared with a citizen of Szeged, whom they have known, saying, "Diese junge Frau kommt mit, samt Kind und Schwägerin." The 3 gentlemen did not know what was the reason for this young lady to be also chosen on the list of the 66, but of course they were included in the list. Unfortunately, I don't remember the names. I just remember that she was called Agnes Heksch, or maybe that was her maiden surname, and her sister-in-law worked in a bookstore or library. So then comes my task to find out, based on these details, who was this Agnes, who were the 66 people, and who were all the other 8,500 people deported from Szeged in those 3 days. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dora. It was fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. And now we are getting to Katerina.
Yes. Hi.
See
Yeah,
yes,
I'm.
you are. So, Elena, the floor is yours if you are there.
Thank you so much. Can you
I'll
hear
see
me?
you.
Yes, we can.
Great. So because I'm joining from the research trip, and I'm now in the Russian city of Kostroma at the Volga River, where I'm together with the colleagues from the Center of Jewish Art, document the synagogues and the cemeteries. So I hope that everything works out well with the internet. Yeah, my name is Ekaterina Oleszkiewicz, and my main field of expertise is the history of Jewish childhood in the Russian Empire.
Just excuse me, Katerina,
Yeah.
we are not seeing you.
It's strange because I'll try to switch
We see
off my video and switch it on again. Is it all right now?
Here. I can see.
we
her.
see
We
you.
do see her.
Okay, great. Yeah, probably there was some technical error. Yeah, whatever. So just a moment, I'll share my presentation. And yeah, so as I mentioned, my main area of expertise is the history of Jewish childhood in the Russian Empire, and I'm writing my PhD on this topic. And I work pretty a lot with the AGO documents, and therefore I'm very happy to participate in this workshop and to discuss the methodological challenges and all the other challenges and opportunities the AGO documents present for the researchers. So as we all know and understand, the main problem, or maybe the main advantage of AGO documents, is their subjectivity. So especially when one talks about the childhood, and it's the autobiography, which was written when the person was aged like 50, 60, 70. Usually people write autobiographies when they are in their elder years rather than in the youth. So we can understand that it creates much space for bias and also for the revelation of the events of childhood in the light of the adult views. And I base my research mostly on the autobiographies written by Jews who spent their childhood in the Russian Empire. And therefore, I found this question really fascinating and challenging for my research, and tried to find an answer to it. And so basically my question is, what influences more the childhood narrative? Whether we can see the actual experience of childhood in this narrative, or it's just the product of the adult beliefs. To answer this question, I've chosen two people with very similar factual conditions of childhood, but very different views and life trajectories as adults, to try to check whether their the childhood narrative is similar or different. And the two people I've chosen are Moshe Leib Lilienblum and Rabbi Eliyahu David Rabinovich Teumim, who have like many factual similarities in the events they experience in the childhood. that although their ideologies is very different, and so basically nothing except the beard unites these people as adults. So what are the similarities? Both of them were born in 1843. We have some difficulties with the date of birth of Rabinovich Tumim Haderet, but yeah, we have some sources where it stated that he was born in 1845, but still this difference of 2 years doesn't make much difference. Both of them were born in the Kovna province, and not only they were born there, but their families spent some significant time of several generations in this area. So they originally come from this geographical region. Their social position is a bit different because Lilian Blum's father is described as a poor craftsman, but also he has the rabbinical ancestry, and he represented himself and he imagined himself as the Ben Tovim, so as kind of significant person with the rabbinical roots. The father of Haderet was also poor, but he was a rabbi. But the poverty was unfortunately quite common feature of the life of the rabbis in the Russian Empire at that moment. Both of them experienced the death of the mothers, and both mothers died of cholera, and both fathers remarried later, so both of them had stepmothers. Both families had quite traditional ambitions of their sons, and they wanted them to become rabbis and to be great in the Torah. Both authors were married rather young, and as we see from the information about their marriage, marriage conditions, probably their social position was still somehow similar and not that different, because the dowries and the castes were approximately the same. So as we see here, it's basically maybe not identical, but very similar childhoods. And we would probably expect that from this childhood, two quite similar people would evolve. But it wasn't so. It wasn't so at all. I just forgot. I wanted to show you that geographically they come from the same region, because Rabinovich Tumim was born here in Pinkham. Then he traveled with his family to this place, to Shillel. Then his father moved to Rogali, and he himself moved to Ponevezh to get married. And Lilian Blum was born in Keidani and traveled later to Vilkomir to get married to a local girl. So here are the we saw the similarities, but the persons were very different in their adult life. And as all of you know, Lilian Blum was the profound Maskilic writer, and even the icon of the anti-traditional movement. And he suggested many reforms to be done to Judaism, and later he became a Palestinophile, which was also very modernist ideology. Rabinovich Tumim was, on the contrary, he was a rabbi. He was an Orthodox leader, and later he became at Rosh Yeshivat Mir, and later on, in his late years, he became a chief rabbi of Ashkenazi Prussian community in Jerusalem. So it's very different life trajectories, and also their autobiographical writing was very different, because Leland Bloom began to write rather early, in his late 20s, early 30s, and his autobiography was published already at 1876, when he was aged 33. And very soon it became a bestseller, the iconic book, which influenced a lot of people who later wrote their autobiographies. And it covers the span of 30 years, of first 30 years of his life. Rabinovich Teumim Ha'aderet began to write his autobiography quite late. Apparently he kept notes or some kind of the diary, but still the autobiography as the whole product, the whole work, was combined in his late years, and it was published after his death much later in 1983, and we even don't know if he intended it to be published or it was just kind of manuscript intended for his self-reflection or for his children and grandchildren to understand his life. And also the lifespan of the autobiography of Ha'aderet is much bigger, because he covers like his almost his whole life. So these two autobiographies I've chosen to look at are different in the conditions of autobiographical writing. And we would also expect that these conditions would influence the childhood narrative, which would be quite logical, because if the person writes the account of his life in the age of 30, and if the person writes the account of his life in the age of 60, it probably would be two different accounts. But surprisingly, when we speak about childhood, their accounts are very similar. I'd even say surprisingly similar. Yeah, let's start with the size, the most objective characteristic of the autobiography, or of the certain period described in the autobiography. Both authors describe their childhood in a rather short manner. So Leland Bloom devotes only 15 pages to his first 15 years of life, and in comparison to much more pages devoted to the next 15 years. Rabinovich Teumim makes it a bit longer, but still it's not the hundreds of pages which we may find by other authors. Secondly, both of them describe very similar topics. Both of them focus on education and religious life, and later on their engagement and their marriage. In both autobiographies, the main character, the main figure, is the father of the author. Mother is almost absent in both accounts, which may be understandable for Ha'aderet, because his mother died when he was aged 5. But Leland Bloom's mother died when he was aged 10, so probably he remembered something of her, but chose not to describe these memories. Other family members are mentioned, but very en passant, and both of them don't add any emotional content to the descriptions. Father figure in both autobiographies, it's a loving and a caring person who does a lot for the child, for the benefit of the child, but in both cases it's a very distant person, and we see in both autobiographies we see almost no direct communication between the father and the son. And so, as I mentioned, we have the main topics discussed were education and later engagement in marriage. And the topics that are absent from the autobiography is mostly emotional involvement in the family relations and the account of the everyday activities of the everyday life. And finally, the last characteristic I'd like to point out here is the image of the author as a child. Interestingly, both of the authors depict themselves in childhood in very adult-like manner. And they somehow portray themselves as small adults and not as children. And one obviously would expect to see the differences inspired by the adult ideologies in these autobiographies. And we indeed see these differences, but they are not so major as we would expect them to be, because basically they present mostly in the childhood account. They present mostly in the evaluation of the events and the actions, but not in the way how the event was described, how it was organized, who were the main actors, and so on. So, for example, if we go back to the last example I gave about the image of the author as a child, we see that, for example, Lilienblum was quite angry with his family and his environment for not letting him to experience the actual childhood, for not letting him to behave like the boy, like a small boy. And he feels angry about that, and he feels critical about the society which didn't let him experience that. While Deret, yeah, he writes the same content, but he feels quite okay with that. Maybe he even feels that it's a desired feature for the child. So we see here the difference of the ideologies, but the very event, fact, feature of the childhood is basically the same. The next question, which logically arises here, is why these accounts are so similar. And my answer is that both authors were raised in the very similar traditional environment. And they went through the same stages in the childhood. So they basically experienced very similar childhood. And despite the fact that they evolved in the very different adults, they imbibed certain discourse of childhood as children. And it's not only the discourse of childhood, it's a certain type of experience and a certain type of behavior inspired by this discourse. And basically, they could do nothing except reproducing this discourse because it's the only experience of childhood they had. And even Lilienblum, who was quite unsatisfied with this experience and who criticizes a lot, he can't get out of it. He can't get rid of it. He's still inside of this experience, which basically shaped his mind. And I'd like to point out that it's not only these two authors who produced such similar account of childhood. Since I deal a lot with the childhood narratives in the autobiographies, I can say that when you read a lot of them, you begin to distinguish between two main types. So at least when we speak about the Jewish autobiographies written by Jews who came from Eastern Europe, and describe the 19th or early 20th century. The narrative I've pointed out, the narrative by Lilienblum and Rabinovich-Seumim, I call it the pre-modern narrative. And there is also another type, I call it modern narrative, which is much more emotional and much more focused on the everyday life and the everyday activities with parents, and is also characterized with much closer relations with parents. So basically we have the group, the big two groups of people who had very different childhoods and who reflected them in their autobiographical writing. And yeah, and here I'd like to proceed to conclusions and to state once more that in my example, we have two people with very similar actual childhoods, but very different views as adults, even opposite views as adults, because they were basically, if not enemies, but they were obviously not satisfied with each other's views. They still produce very similar childhood narrative, even despite the difference in the conditions of autobiographical writing. And the general typology of the narrative also remains the same by both of them. And we can still notice the influence of the adult beliefs, but mostly in the evaluation of the described events, which bring us to the conclusion that in the case of the Eastern Europe, or more precisely Russian Empire, and the description of childhood in the 19th and early 20th century, this description is shaped more by the actual childhood experience rather than by adult ideology. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was really good. And we had three amazing presentations. And now we have time for questions.
I have some questions for Ekaterina.
Yes.
One, I read the memoirs of Yechezkel Kutik, which is very much similar to what you describe, a bit more about the mother, but not really much. And you could see it in many, many memoirs of the period. Maybe if you look at Etke's book, Lita in Jerusalem, where he published the writings of a man from Keln in Lithuania, it would help you to understand the way the lack of influence of mother, especially on boys. You could see it more in girls, but when you talk about boys, it hardly exists. And a second note, when you talk about Lilienblum, it reminds me of a book about 60 years earlier, The Story of My Life by Shlomo Maimon. Again, married in a very young age, running away toward Askala, and so maybe this is the narrative. People going to Askala have got a certain narrative following. I'm not talking about the childhood. I agree totally that it's about the same because it was the same environment. But when you talk about later, if you talk about Lilienblum, you say he wrote it when he was 33. A very young man, half of his life married. Since he married, so he looks at it differently. And if you look on Maskilim going to live in Odessa, like a bit later, Hadam and others, they also describe him, they are running away from the house, from the home, but not from the childhood. You could see in Hadam, in others, Okay, it was fine. It was good. But it doesn't, we look at childhood in our time and age, we make it much more important than they made it for themselves, because they didn't look at childhood as a very important phase of life. And
Yes,
so they wrote a bit about it, but not too much.
yeah, I basically agree, and thank you a lot for your remarks and for the references. It's obviously the narratives of Shlomo Maimon and also of Ginsburg. Obviously, they have a lot of influence, and Lillian Bloom obviously read them, and he even like says it in the autobiography that everything he experienced was already described by Ginsburg.
Yes.
So it obviously had an influence, but the point is that this type of the narrative, it's not only Maskilic narrative. It's also the narrative of many other people who have no direct connection to Haskalah, and who were born later, because we can't say about the people who were born in the 70s and the 80s that they belong to Haskalah, even if they go to the modernist movements like Zionism or any other. So I'd rather say that it's indeed two different perceptions of the childhood, and you were right when you pointed out that they didn't see the childhood as something very, very important, because
Very true.
yeah, and even Ginsburg, who actually devoted his whole autobiography to his childhood and youth, and even for him, it's different. It's not our contemporary perception of the childhood, so yeah, it's two different perceptions, two different discourses, and what's interesting that I believe that it's not only discourse, it's also the actual experience of these people, the actual experience of the childhood which they had. It's not the point that their, I don't know, their parents didn't love them or something like that. They did, but the idea of love and the idea of relations to children was different.
Yeah, but there is one other point that you should take into account. When you talk about Lillian Bloom and you talk about the Aderet, they came from a poor background. So it's very interesting to try and find some biographies of people who came from a better, from a richer one. I think you could see a difference. You could see much more the influence of the mother and other stuff.
I don't think so, because it's, I don't have the examples right now, but I really like I have these huge tables with the autobiographies and with these types and so on. And my impression is that it wasn't the feature somehow connected to the social or economic status. So there is the point that the ones who were wealthier, they were usually more modernist, and modernist not in the sense that they were more like intended to Haskalah or something like that, but they were more modernist in their discourse of childhood. Just because the discourses spread usually from the elite to the poorer strata rather than vice versa. So I think that here it's the question of the discourse rather than of the social position.
Okay.
If I may, I would like to comment about Dora's presentation, which was Very interesting, the whole use of IT, but I think there are 2 points there that we should take into account. One is you talked about contradictions in the materials. We know that people after the Holocaust filled official documents according to what they thought will be the best answer. We have a lot of examples with children moving their ages all the time, whether it's better to be above 16 or below 16. The same with what is your profession. Some professions will get you a visa to Canada. Some professions will not. So you're trying to guess what will be the profession I should put. So I think you probably know all this, but I'm just commenting because you talked about this. IT will not solve this. It will just show that there is a contradiction. But there's a big story behind the contradiction. Because
IT actually can solve this because once we clean data, we'll put it into a so-called graph database and make a network of all these connections. And there is certain data to which we can add a timestamp. So such as, for example, health status. At a certain time, you can have cancer, and then you can either like get healthy again or not. And occupation is such that at a certain time period, you have this kind of occupation, and then 5 years later, you have a different. So there are certain features that can be arranged according to a certain period. And I hope that this will solve partly these contradictions.
Yes, but we have to remember that people chose not to give the real data. And this happened not after the Holocaust. Maybe during the Holocaust also, you come to a camp, you say you are older, you say you are a mechanic when you are not. I mean, we know this, so we have to take this with, I'm just saying that the contradiction itself is important to record.
Yes, definitely, and we completely agree.
Yeah, but to be aware, we don't have to solve the contradiction, because unless we then find out that I said I was a seamstress because I knew as a seamstress I could get a visa to Canada. But people said a lot of things like.
Totally. But for example, when there is a contradiction that someone says that she had 5 kids and the other one says 7 kids, Mako Orthodox Jewry, there are certain kinds of contradictions that have to be solved. And another thing that we have to bear in mind is that when, for example, the ghettoization list was written in May 1944, in approximately 20 days, that we know based on the death cases, who was recorded there, who was already dead, and who was recorded there, who was not dead yet. So all the circumstances were everything but ideal. So they didn't have like a quiet office where they could work on this for a month very precisely and check it all the time. And the same when people returned from Theresienstadt or Strasshof for all these locations, their data was taken, but the aim of these data was not to make a very precise list, just to like more or less record it on the spot in 1945 in June, on the day when they arrived back. But the aim was not to make a precise list. So knowing all these circumstances, we have to struggle with all the challenges.
And even to accept that we want to have all the answers.
Yes, definitely. And that also this is not a genre where we can expect to have a 100% success and a 100% precise list. It's impossible.
Anyone else? So Chaim, I will pass the baton to you.
Okay. We had a long day today, and we are going to have a longer one tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed it. I did. And we'll see each other tomorrow. I'll be talking to you at the end of it a bit about publications. because I had already some talks with some periodicals, and we'll see. Maybe we will get something out of it. Okay, so see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
so much.
speakers.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks to everybody. Bye-bye. See you
Bye.
tomorrow.
Bye-bye.